They said I was cheap. My own granddaughter, Chloe, her voice dripping with the casual disdain of youth, echoed by her mother's knowing smirk. Cheap. After a lifetime of giving, that was my label. So, I did something they never expected. I decided to sell the house, the very house she'd earmarked for her fairy tale wedding, the one I was apparently too cheap to just hand over. This is the story of how that single, cutting word led me to reclaim not just my property, but my life. Stick around till the end to hear how it all unfolded. And tell me, where in the world you are watching from. Comment below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. My name is Amelia, and for 68 years, I believed in the sanctity of family, in the boundless depth of a mother's love, a grandmother's affection. My late husband, Arthur, and I had built our lives around this principle. He was a good man, a kind man, his presence a steady warmth that still lingered in the corners of our home even 5 years after he'd passed. We hadn't been wealthy, not by any stretch of the imagination, but we had been comfortable, and more importantly, we had been rich in love and shared purpose. Our son, Michael, was the center of our world. We'd poured everything into him, our time, our resources, our hopes. The house, a rambling Victorian with a garden Arthur had patiently coaxed into a riot of color year after year, was more than just bricks and mortar. It was where Michael took his first steps, where he'd proudly displayed his school artwork on the fridge, where he'd brought home his first girlfriend, Sarah, a woman whose sharp eyes and even sharper ambition had always made me feel a little uneasy, though I'd dutifully pushed those feelings down for Michael's sake. It was where Christmases were celebrated with gusto, Easters with egg hunts in the sprawling garden, and countless Sunday dinners filled the air with the aroma of roast chicken and Arthur's slightly too loud laughter. Every wall, every floorboard, seemed to hold an echo of our family's history, our joys, our quiet sorrows. Arthur always said, "This house is our heart, Amelia. It's seen us through everything," and he was right. After he was gone, its familiarity was a comfort, a solid presence in the shifting landscape of my grief. Michael and Sarah married, and soon Chloe arrived, our granddaughter. I was overjoyed. I threw myself into the role of grandmother with the same devotion I'd given to being a mother. I babysat endlessly, often at the expense of my own fledgling social life after Arthur passed. I helped with school fees when Michael's business ventures faltered, provided a substantial down payment for their first apartment, and later, a larger one for their current house, a modern, sterile place that Sarah adored and I found utterly charmless. I never questioned it. It was what family did. It was what love meant. Or so I believed. My own needs, my own desires, became whispers, then silence, easily ignored in the louder demands of their lives. I convinced myself that their happiness was my happiness, that my purpose was intrinsically linked to their well-being and comfort. The incident, the one that planted the seed of this extraordinary upheaval, happened on a bright Saturday afternoon. Chloe, now 23 and recently engaged to a young man named Liam, who seemed pleasant enough, but utterly under her thumb, had come over with Sarah. Michael trailed behind them, looking, as he often did, like a man perpetually trying to appease two strong-willed women. They were in the early, giddy stages of wedding planning. I'd made tea and laid out my best shortbread, the recipe Arthur had loved. The air in the sunroom, usually so peaceful with its view of the roses Arthur had planted, felt charged, expectant. "Grandma," Chloe began, her voice sweet, a little too sweet, like honey masking something bitter. "Liam and I have been thinking about the venue." She glanced at Sarah, who gave her an encouraging nod. "And, well, nowhere feels as special as here. Your garden would be perfect for the ceremony, and we could have the reception spilling out from the dining room onto the patio. It would be a dream." I smiled, a genuine warmth spreading through me. The thought of Chloe, my only grandchild, getting married in the garden Arthur had poured his soul into, did have a certain appeal. "That's a lovely idea, dear," I said. "We can certainly talk about the logistics." Sarah then chimed in, her tone practical, bordering on managerial. "Of course, Amelia, there would need to be a few upgrades. The patio needs repaving, it's terribly uneven. And the guest bathroom is practically archaic. We'd need to have that completely redone. And the kitchen, if we are having professional caterers." She trailed off, waving a dismissive hand, as if the current state of my perfectly functional kitchen was an affront. My smile faltered. Upgrades. Redone. This wasn't just about using the garden, this sounded like a complete overhaul, tailored to their tastes, on my dime. I remembered the constant stream of suggestions for my home over the years, the subtle hints that it was outdated, not quite up to their modern standards. I thought of the money I'd already given them, the sacrifices I'd made, the times I'd put my own plans on hold. A small knot of unease tightened in my chest. "Well," I began carefully, "those are significant changes, Sarah. We'd have to discuss the costs involved." Chloe pouted, a look I recognized from her toddler years, now deployed with adult precision. "Oh, Grandma, don't be like that. It's my special day. Surely you wouldn't want it to be anything less than perfect." Her eyes, so like Michael's, held a flicker of something that wasn't entirely innocent. It was then that the word was uttered. Sarah, seeing my hesitation, leaned forward, a condescending smile playing on her lips. "Amelia, we know money is a bit tight for you since Arthur passed." A blatant falsehood, as Arthur had left me very well provided for. A fact they conveniently ignored or perhaps genuinely didn't grasp, given my frugal lifestyle. A lifestyle born not of necessity, but of principle. "But surely for Chloe's wedding, you wouldn't want to be, well." Chloe finished the sentence, her voice light, almost teasing, but the barb landed with surgical precision. "You wouldn't want to be cheap, Grandma, would you?" She giggled, a tinkling sound that grated on my nerves. Cheap. The word hung in the air, ugly and offensive. Cheap. Me, who had poured out love and resources like water for them. Me, who had never hesitated to help, often to my own detriment. I looked at Michael, my son, expecting him to leap to my defense, to admonish his daughter, his wife. He just shifted uncomfortably in his chair, avoiding my gaze, fiddling with a loose thread on the armrest. His silence was a hammer blow, more painful than their words. In that moment, the sunroom, my sanctuary, felt cold, alien. The aroma of roses suddenly seemed cloying. I felt a flush creep up my neck, a mixture of anger and profound hurt. My heart, which had been so full of warmth for them just moments before, felt like it had been squeezed by an icy hand. Disbelief warred with a sudden, sickening clarity. Was this what they truly thought of me? A means to an end. An obstacle to be wheedled or shamed into compliance. The years of self-sacrifice, the unquestioning love, all of it seemed to curdle in my stomach. I saw not my beloved granddaughter, but a stranger with calculating eyes. I saw not my daughter-in-law, but a woman whose disdain for me was now nakedly apparent. And my son was a coward. I said nothing for a long moment, the silence stretching taut. The shortbread sat untouched. The tea grew cold. Finally, I managed a strained, "I see," it was all I could trust myself to say. The word cheap echoed in my mind, a discordant clang against the chimes of memory, of love given freely, now apparently devalued and dismissed. The dream of Chloe's wedding in Arthur's garden withered and died right there, in the chilly air of my sunroom. And something else died too, a part of my heart that had always belonged, unquestioningly to them. The days that followed were shrouded in a peculiar kind of numbness, a protective layer my mind seemed to have thrown over the raw wound. Chloe and Sarah left soon after that disastrous conversation, their mission clearly unaccomplished, leaving a palpable tension in their wake. Michael mumbled something about them not meaning it, about wedding stress, but his words were hollow, unconvincing even to his own ears, I suspected. He didn't meet my eyes then either. He left quickly, eager to escape the discomfort he had so passively allowed to fester. I walked through my house, the house Arthur and I had filled with life, and it felt different. Or perhaps, I was different. The familiar objects, the photographs on the mantelpiece, the worn armchair where Arthur used to read, they all seemed to mock my naivety. Had I been so blind? So willingly oblivious to the subtle shifts in their regard for me over the years? The casual assumptions, the increasing sense of entitlement, the expectation that Grandma would always provide, always acquiesce. I felt like a ghost in my own life, a character in a play whose lines were written by everyone but herself. The house, my sanctuary, now felt like a stage for their demands, a valuable asset they were appraising, rather than a home filled with love and memories. My internal monologue became a relentless replay of the past few decades. I saw myself, younger, more energetic, always rushing to meet their needs. The school runs for Chloe when Michael and Sarah were too busy. The weekends given over to babysitting so they could have their time. The checks written for music lessons, sports equipment, class trips, always with a loving note, always without expectation of repayment. I remembered the pride I'd felt when Chloe graduated, the quiet satisfaction when Michael finally achieved some stability in his career, stability I had often financially cushioned. And for what? To be dismissed as cheap, because I hesitated to fund an extravagant renovation for a one-day event in my own home. The word itself was a cruel irony. I had never been extravagant with myself, it was true. Arthur and I believed in saving, in being prudent. But when it came to Michael, and later Chloe, my purse strings had always been loose, my generosity almost reflexive. It wasn't about the money, it was about the respect. Or rather, the utter lack of it. They hadn't just asked for the use of the house, they had demanded it, along with costly alterations, assuming my compliance as a given. And when I showed a flicker of independent thought, of fiscal responsibility concerning my own property, I was labeled. It was a dismissal not just of my financial capacity, but of my very personhood, my feelings, my history. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie in bed, Arthur's side of it cold and empty, and stare at the ceiling, the shadows playing tricks on my eyes. I saw Sarah's smirk, Chloe's dismissive pout, Michael's averted gaze. Each image was a fresh stab. I felt an immense loneliness, a desolation that seeped into my bones. It was the loneliness of being profoundly misunderstood, of being valued not for who I was, but for what I could provide. And now, apparently, I wasn't providing enough, or in the right way. I felt erased. As if Amelia, the woman, the individual, had ceased to exist, replaced by a grandma, a utility, a resource that was now malfunctioning. I considered trying to talk to Michael again, to explain the depth of my hurt. But what was the point? He had already shown his allegiance, or rather, his lack of courage. Any conversation would likely devolve into him making excuses for them, urging me to be the bigger person, to smooth things over for the sake of family peace, family peace. It sounded like a euphemism for my continued capitulation. The thought of further humiliation, of my genuine pain being minimized yet again, was unbearable. So, I kept my silence, a heavy cloak around my shoulders. This isolation deepened. Phone calls from Michael became perfunctory, carefully avoiding the topic of the wedding or my feelings. Chloe and Sarah made no contact at all. It was as if by not acknowledging their cruelty, they could pretend it hadn't happened. Or worse, they believed they were in the right, that my reaction was unreasonable. I was the one being difficult, not them. I was the one being cheap. The garden, Arthur's pride, began to feel like a burden. Every blooming rose, every carefully tended shrub, seemed to whisper their entitled demands. Chloe's vision of her dream wedding here now felt like a violation, a desecration of something sacred. I found myself avoiding the sunroom, its bright cheerfulness a stark contrast to the gloom in my heart. This was my rock bottom. Not a dramatic, public collapse, but a quiet, internal crumbling. I felt old, tired, and utterly, devastatingly alone. The love I had poured out so freely for so many years felt like it had been siphoned into a void, leaving me hollowed out, a husk of my former self. The foundation of my life, my family, had proven to be built on sand, and the tide of their selfishness had washed it all away. Weeks turned into a month, then nearly 2. The silence from Chloe and Sarah remained absolute, a solid wall of unspoken accusation. Michael's calls were infrequent, strained affairs, filled with trivialities that danced around the elephant in the room. I existed in a kind of limbo, the initial shock giving way to a dull, persistent ache. The house, once my comfort, felt more like a gilded cage, its beauty a constant reminder of what I stood to provide rather than who I was. The word cheap still ricocheted in my thoughts, a venomous little dart. One rainy afternoon, unable to bear the oppressive silence of the living areas any longer, I found myself in Arthur's old study. It was a room I rarely entered, dust motes dancing in the weak light filtering through the blinds. His presence was strongest here, amidst his books, his papers, his meticulously organized collections. I ran my fingers over the smooth, worn wood of his desk, a wave of grief, fresh and sharp, washing over me. Oh, Arthur, what would you have made of all this? Your pragmatic, no-nonsense approach to life, your deep well of kindness, how I missed it. Idly, I began to sort through some of the drawers, more for something to do than with any real purpose. Old bank statements, warranties for appliances long since replaced, photographs of a much younger Michael. And then, tucked away at the back of the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of his beloved gardening magazines, I found a thick, leather-bound journal. His handwriting, bold and familiar, adorned the first page, thoughts, reflections, and other nonsense for Amelia, should she ever need them. My heart gave a lurch. He had never mentioned this journal to me. With trembling fingers, I opened it. The entries were sporadic, dating back over many years. He wrote about his garden, his frustrations with faulty plumbing, his quiet pride in Michael's small achievements. And then, I found an entry from about a year before he passed. He must have been feeling reflective, perhaps a premonition of his own mortality. He wrote about the house, about us. This old house, he'd penned, it's been good to us. It's seen laughter and tears, triumphs and scraped knees. I hope, when I'm gone, it continues to be a place of peace for Amelia. She's poured so much of herself into it, into us. She deserves her own peace, her own comfort, without endless demands. It's hers, to do with as she pleases. May it always be her sanctuary, not her burden. Further down, almost as an afterthought, he'd added, and if it ever becomes a burden, Amelia, my love, don't you hesitate to find your peace elsewhere. Your happiness is all that matters. Tears streamed down my face, blurring the ink. His words, reaching out to me from across the veil of death, were like a balm to my wounded spirit. Her sanctuary, not her burden, and hadn't it become just that? A burden? A source of contention, a symbol of their expectations and my perceived failures. He understood. He had always understood. Then, almost as if guided by his hand, I remembered something else. When we'd redone our wills, years ago, after Michael was grown and married, Arthur had been insistent. The house, which we owned outright, was to be solely in my name upon his passing. It simplifies things, my dear, he'd said with a wink. No arguments, no complications. It's yours. At the time, I hadn't given it much thought beyond the practicalities. But now, his foresight struck me with the force of a revelation. It was my house. Not Michael's inheritance in waiting. Not Chloe's presumed wedding venue. Mine. To do with as I pleased. The realization was like a sudden shaft of sunlight piercing through a dense fog. I sat there, in the dusty silence of Arthur's study, his journal clutched in my hands, and a new feeling began to stir within me. It wasn't the despair of the past weeks, nor the initial shock and hurt. It was something else entirely, a flicker, then a growing warmth. Hope? No, not just hope. It was determination. A cold, clear resolve began to crystallize in my mind. The anger I had suppressed for so long didn't vanish, but it transformed. It was no longer the helpless fury of a victim, it became a focused energy, a righteous indignation. Arthur's words echoed in my head, "Your happiness is all that matters," and my happiness was not being served by clinging to a property that had become a battleground, a symbol of disrespect. The first seed of a plan began to germinate. It was audacious, terrifying, and exhilarating all at once. If this house, this beautiful, memory-filled prison, was the only thing they truly valued about my connection to them, then perhaps they needed to learn to appreciate its absence. What if I sold it? The thought, once unthinkable, now bloomed with an irresistible logic. Sell the house, take the proceeds, and build a new life for myself, a life of peace, on my own terms, far from their grasping hands and cutting words. Arthur would have approved. In fact, reading his journal, I felt he was practically urging me on. The label cheap replayed in my mind, but this time, it didn't sting. Instead, it fueled my resolve. Oh, they thought I was cheap, did they? They had no idea what I was capable of. The decision, once made, settled in my soul with a surprising sense of rightness. The despair that had clung to me like a shroud began to recede, replaced by a quiet, steady hum of purpose. Arthur's words from his journal became my mantra, "Your happiness is all that matters," and I realized, with a clarity that was almost painful, that my happiness could no longer be found in contorting myself to fit their expectations, or in silently absorbing their casual cruelties. My first step was to seek professional guidance. I didn't want some local busybody realtor, who might inadvertently let slip my intentions to the town, and by extension, to Michael or Sarah. I needed discretion, professionalism, and someone who wouldn't question my motives. I remembered Arthur mentioning a Mrs. Eleanor Albright, a highly respected realtor from a neighboring, larger town. He'd dealt with her firm for some commercial property appraisals years ago, and had been impressed by her acumen and integrity. Finding her number was easy enough. Making that call was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. My hand trembled as I dialed. What if she thought I was a foolish old woman, making a rash decision? But Mrs. Albright's voice was calm, kind, and utterly businesslike. I explained, briefly, that I was considering selling my large family home and downsizing. I didn't delve into the emotional turmoil, the family drama. I simply stated my wish for a discreet and efficient process. She listened patiently, asked a few pertinent questions about the property, and scheduled an appointment to visit the following week, assuring me of her firm's complete confidentiality. Next, I consulted a solicitor, a woman named Miss Peterson, recommended by Mrs. Albright's office. I needed to understand the legal implications, the tax consequences, and to ensure that everything was handled impeccably. Ms. Peterson was sharp, empathetic, and wonderfully thorough. She reviewed the deed, confirming my sole ownership, and walked me through the steps of a sale, offering advice on how to protect my assets thereafter. Leaving her office that day, I felt a significant weight lift from my shoulders. I wasn't just dreaming, I was acting. I had allies. The plan began to take shape, not as a campaign of revenge, but as a strategy for liberation. I would sell the house, quietly and efficiently. I would find a smaller, manageable place for myself, perhaps a modern apartment, or a little cottage, something that was mine alone, free from the ghosts of expectation. The proceeds would ensure my financial independence for the rest of my days, allowing me to travel a little, perhaps, or support causes Arthur and I had cared about. As for Chloe's wedding venue, that, I decided with a newfound firmness, was no longer my concern. They had made their assumptions, and they would have to deal with the consequences of their own words and actions. A subtle transformation began within me. The perpetual anxiety that had gnawed at me started to dissipate. I found myself sleeping better. I started taking walks in the park again, something I hadn't done much since Arthur passed. I even bought a new dress, a cheerful blue one, a color I hadn't worn in years. When Michael called, his conversation still tiptoeing around the unspoken, I was polite, but brief, offering no openings for him to broach the wedding or my mood. Sarah and Chloe remained silent, and I made no effort to bridge the chasm they had created. My detachment, I think, puzzled Michael. He was used to me being the family peacemaker, the one who would eventually cave for the sake of harmony. This new, quiet Amelia was an unknown quantity. The process of preparing the house for potential viewings became a cathartic act of reclaiming my space and my memories. I began to declutter, room by room. But this wasn't just a simple tidying up. Each item I sorted, I considered, was this a memory I wanted to keep, or a chain to a past I needed to release? Old toys of Michael's, Chloe's outgrown clothes I'd carefully stored, Sarah's cast-off decorations she deemed too traditional for her own home, but perfectly fine for mine. I packed them into boxes. Some for charity, some for storage, some, frankly, for the bin. If they ever asked, I'd simply say I was doing a bit of overdue spring cleaning. It was, in a way, the truth. I was clearing out the old to make way for the new, not just in my cupboards, but in my life. Mrs. Albright arrived on a crisp autumn morning. She was a woman of quiet elegance, her eyes sharp but kind. She toured the house and garden, her appreciation for its character and potential evident. She didn't pry into my reasons for selling, focusing instead on the practicalities: market value, optimal listing strategies, and how to manage viewings with minimal disruption. We agreed on a price that was fair but ambitious, and she suggested initially listing it without a prominent for sale sign in the yard, relying instead on online platforms and her network of serious buyers to maintain discretion for as long as possible. This suited my plan perfectly. The photographer came a few days later, capturing the house in the golden autumn light, making it look almost ethereal. Seeing those professional photos, I felt a pang of sadness, yes, but also a thrill of impending freedom. The first concrete step of my quiet ascension had been taken, entirely under their radar. The weeks that followed were a strange dance of normalcy and secret activity. On the surface, my life continued much as it had before the fateful cheap comment. I tended the garden, though now with a sense of impending farewell rather than perpetual care. I read my books, paid my bills, and maintained a veneer of calm whenever Michael visited or called. He seemed to interpret my quietness as a sign of resignation, perhaps believing I was slowly coming around to their wedding plans, or at least accepting my designated role as the slightly difficult, but ultimately accommodating matriarch. He'd occasionally make comments like, "Chloe's so excited about the garden, Mom. She's already picking out flowers that will match her bridesmaids' dresses." I would just nod vaguely or change the subject, offering no concrete affirmation, no renewed enthusiasm. My noncommittal responses, I believe, were filed away by him as me still being a bit sensitive, but ultimately harmless. Sarah and Chloe, meanwhile, were in the full throes of wedding hysteria. I'd hear snippets from Michael's frantic discussions about caterers, florists, guest lists. Occasionally, Sarah would call, her tone brisk and businesslike, to ask if she could just pop over with the wedding planner to measure the dining room again, or to see if the wisteria by the porch could be trimmed back to allow for better photographs. Each request was like a tiny needle prick. I'd find plausible excuses: a prior appointment, not feeling well, the decorators coming to give a quote for some freshening up, a carefully chosen ambiguity. My polite but firm deflections seemed to irritate Sarah, but she was too consumed by the wedding whirlwind to push too hard, likely assuming I'd fall into line when the time came. They were operating under the grand assumption that the house was theirs for the taking, a backdrop for their perfect day. The sheer arrogance of it continued to astound me, and it only strengthened my resolve. Mrs. Albright, true to her word, was a model of discretion and efficiency. Viewings were scheduled mostly on weekday mornings when Michael was at work and Chloe and Sarah were unlikely to drop by unannounced. I'd make myself scarce, going for long walks or visiting the library. It was an odd sensation, knowing strangers were walking through my home, evaluating its spaces, its potential as their future. Each viewing brought a mix of anxiety and anticipation. What if no one wanted it? What if I'd misjudged? But Mrs. Albright remained optimistic, her feedback consistently positive. "It's a unique property, Amelia," she'd say. "It has character. The right buyer will appreciate that." Then, one chilly November afternoon, Mrs. Albright called. "Amelia," she said, her voice holding a new note of excitement, "we have an offer. A very good one. Cash buyers, no complicated chain, and they love the house just as it is. They are even charmed by the archaic guest bathroom." I could almost hear the smile in her voice when she said that last part. My heart leaped. A cash offer, from people who appreciated the house's soul, not just its potential for renovation. It felt like Arthur himself was giving his blessing. We discussed the terms. The price was slightly below our initial asking, but still excellent, and the straightforward nature of the cash offer was incredibly appealing. No haggling over repairs, no waiting for mortgage approvals. They wanted a relatively quick closing, just before Christmas. It was perfect. "I accept," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. The words felt momentous, a definitive turning point. The next few days were a flurry of paperwork, handled with quiet efficiency by Mrs. Albright and Ms. Peterson. The sold sticker wouldn't go on the sign in the yard until all contingencies were cleared, which would be very soon. The online listing would be updated simultaneously. The time for quiet maneuvering was drawing to a close. Soon, the reckoning would begin. I felt a strange mixture of trepidation and a steely calm. I had set the pieces in motion, and now I just had to wait for the inevitable discovery. The moment of revelation came sooner than I anticipated, and not entirely as I had planned. Chloe, it turned out, had a habit of browsing real estate websites, just for fun, as she later wailed. She'd apparently been keeping an eye on listings in my neighborhood, perhaps to get ideas for decor, or to see what other grand properties were like. One evening, just as I was settling down with a cup of chamomile tea and a new novel, my phone rang. It was Michael, his voice tight with a mixture of confusion and panic. "Mom? Chloe just called me, she's hysterical. She says, She says she saw the house listed online. As sale agreed, Mom. What's going on? It's some kind of mistake, right? I took a slow sip of my tea. Here we go, I thought. No, Michael, I said, my voice perfectly calm, betraying none of the adrenaline coursing through me. It's not a mistake. The house has been sold. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line, so profound I could hear the faint crackle of static. Then, his voice, when it finally came, was incredulous. Sold? But, the wedding. Chloe's wedding. What about the garden? The reception? Well, Michael, I replied, keeping my tone even, Chloe and Sarah will have to find another venue for the wedding. This house will belong to someone else before then. I could almost hear his jaw drop. The carefully constructed facade of their entitlement was beginning to crumble. The quiet satisfaction I felt was immense, yet tinged with a residual sadness for the son I thought I knew. The storm was about to break. The stunned silence that followed my calm announcement to Michael stretched for what felt like an eternity. I could hear his ragged breathing on the other end of the line, the frantic whirring of his mind as he tried to process what I'd just said. Sold, he finally choked out, his voice a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. Mom, you can't be serious. Chloe. Sarah, they've planned everything around the house. The deposits, the invitations are about to be printed with the address. That is unfortunate, Michael, I replied, my voice remaining serenely composed, a stark contrast to the turmoil I could sense brewing on his end. But the sale is final. The new owners will be taking possession in mid-December. I didn't add just before Christmas, though the timing wasn't lost on me. But why, he stammered. Why wouldn't you tell us? Why would you do this? The undertone of accusation was clear. How dare I make a decision about my own property without consulting them, without prioritizing their desires? I decided it was time for me to downsize, Michael, I said simply. This house is too big for one person. It's time for a change. I offered no further explanation, no apology, no opening for negotiation. This was not a discussion, it was a statement of fact. It wasn't long before the full force of their collective fury descended. Less than an hour later, my doorbell chimed insistently, repeatedly, with an aggressive impatience that signaled Sarah's arrival. I opened the door to find her standing there, face flushed, eyes blazing. Chloe was beside her, already weeping, her mascara starting to run. Michael hovered behind them, looking pale and wretched. Amelia. What is the meaning of this? Sarah launched in, not even bothering with a greeting, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Michael said you've sold the house. You can't have. Chloe's wedding is in 6 months. Actually, Sarah, I can, and I have, I replied, stepping back to allow them into the hallway, though I felt no particular desire for their presence in my home any longer. As I told Michael, the sale is final. Chloe burst into a fresh torrent of tears. Grandma, how could you, she wailed, the earlier sweetness in her voice now replaced by raw, petulant anguish. My dream wedding. You've ruined everything. You said it was a lovely idea for me to get married here. I said it was a lovely idea to talk about the logistics, Chloe, I corrected gently but firmly. And then you and your mother proceeded to demand extensive, costly renovations, and called me cheap, when I hesitated. The word, spoken aloud by me in this context, seemed to hang in the air, making them all visibly flinch. Sarah's face tightened. Chloe's tears seemed to momentarily pause. Michael looked at the floor. That's not fair. Sarah snapped. We were just trying to make it perfect. For Chloe. Any loving grandmother would understand that. any loving grandmother would be happy to help. A loving grandmother, I said, my voice quiet, but carrying an undeniable weight of conviction, also deserves respect. She deserves not to be taken for granted, not to have her home treated like a public venue to be commandeered and altered at will. And she certainly does not deserve to be called cheap by the very people she has spent a lifetime supporting. My composure seemed to infuriate them more than any display of anger on my part could have. Sarah's face contorted with rage. This is about that stupid word, isn't it? You're doing this to punish us. You're being vindictive and cruel. No, Sarah, I said, looking her directly in the eye. This isn't about punishment. This is about my life, my property, and my decision. I am choosing to live my remaining years in a way that brings me peace and contentment, not stress and obligation. The house was becoming a burden, a source of contention, and Arthur himself always said that if it became so, I should find my peace elsewhere. I saw a flicker of something in Michael's eyes when I mentioned Arthur, perhaps a memory of his father's pragmatic nature. Chloe, however, was inconsolable. But my venue? My garden ceremony? All my friends are expecting it, she cried, stamping her foot like a child. You're selfish. You only care about yourself. The irony of that accusation, coming from her, was almost too much to bear. But I held my tongue, letting her outburst wash over me. The young woman standing before me, distorted by tears and fury, bore little resemblance to the sweet grandchild I thought I knew. The entitlement was so deeply ingrained, so blinding, that she genuinely couldn't see beyond her own thwarted desires. Michael finally spoke, his voice pleading. Mom, please. Isn't there anything you can do? Can't you talk to the buyers? Postpone the sale. Liam's parents have already contributed to some of the deposits for things tied to this venue. I looked at my son, a deep weariness settling over me. Michael, I said, the contracts are signed. It's legally binding. And even if it weren't, my decision would remain the same. It is done. The full realization then seemed to hit them with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a tactic. This wasn't a negotiation. This was an irreversible reality. Sarah stared at me, speechless for once, her face a mask of disbelief and impotent rage. Chloe sank onto the bottom stair of the hallway, her sobs now a despairing, defeated sound. Michael ran a hand through his hair, looking utterly lost. They had miscalculated, profoundly. They had assumed my love was unconditional to the point of endless servitude, that my boundaries were infinitely elastic, that their desires would always supersede my own. They had pushed too far, and the quiet, accommodating Amelia they had taken for granted had finally, irrevocably, drawn a line. The power dynamic in that hallway had shifted entirely. I was no longer the supplicant, the one to be managed or placated. I was in control of my destiny, and by extension, I had disrupted theirs in a way they had never imagined possible. The new owners will be doing a final walkthrough next week, I informed them calmly. And the closing is on the 15th of December. I expect the house to be vacated by then. You'll need to make alternative arrangements for Chloe's wedding. The finality in my voice left no room for argument. They had wanted the house. Now they couldn't have it. And it was entirely of their own making. The days following the explosive confrontation were heavy with a strange, strained silence from their quarter, punctuated by the frantic energy of my own preparations to move. The news of the house sale, and therefore the abrupt loss of their wedding venue, sent Chloe and Sarah into a tailspin. Michael, caught in the middle, attempted a few more half-hearted appeals, phoning me with a weary, defeated tone. Mom, Chloe is devastated. Sarah is furious. They are scrambling to find another place, but it's short notice for a spring wedding, and everything decent is either booked or incredibly expensive. Are you absolutely sure you can't reconsider? Michael, I reiterated, my patience wearing thin, but my resolve holding firm. My decision is final. The house is sold. This is no longer up for discussion. They created this situation with their demands and their disrespect. They will have to find a way to resolve it. My voice was calm, but the steel in it was unmistakable. He sighed, a long, drawn-out sound of resignation, and the calls became less frequent. The downfall for them wasn't a dramatic public ruin, but a more intimate, humiliating unraveling of their carefully laid plans. Chloe's dream wedding, meticulously curated to project an image of effortless elegance and family largesse, largely mine, it seemed, was now in tatters. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that they had to settle for a far less picturesque, and considerably more expensive, generic hotel ballroom on an inconvenient date. The grand garden ceremony, the charming old-world backdrop, all gone. There was, I confess, a certain grim satisfaction in knowing that the archaic guest bathroom and uneven patio were no longer their concern. Socially, it was an embarrassment for Sarah, who prided herself on orchestrating flawless events and maintaining a certain image within her social circle. The whispers about why the venue had suddenly changed must have been galling. Chloe, I was told, oscillated between tearful despair and angry outbursts, blaming everyone but herself, me for my selfishness, Michael for not handling me better, Sarah for pushing too hard, though that last one was likely only expressed behind closed doors. Liam, her fiancé, apparently just tried to stay out of the crossfire. Their perfect, Instagrammable wedding was rapidly becoming a stressful, compromised affair. The financial strain of securing a new venue at short notice, without my anticipated contribution for upgrades, also undoubtedly added to their woes. A week before my move-out date, a small, handwritten card appeared in my mailbox. It was from Chloe. The handwriting was shaky. "Grandma," it read, "I'm sorry if my words hurt you. I was just so excited about the wedding, and I always dreamed of getting married in your beautiful garden. I didn't mean to be disrespectful. Maybe we can talk. Love, Chloe." I read the card several times. Was it genuine remorse, or a last-ditch attempt to manipulate me, perhaps hoping I could somehow magically undo the sale or contribute financially to their new, less ideal plans? The phrase, "if my words hurt you," struck me as a classic non-apology. There was no real acknowledgement of the cheap comment, no true understanding of the depth of the disrespect. I felt a pang of sadness for the granddaughter I loved, or at least, the memory of the girl she once was. But the trust had been too severely damaged. I didn't reply to the card. Sarah made no such attempts at reconciliation. Her silence was stony and unforgiving, which was, in its own way, more honest. The process of moving out of the house I had shared with Arthur for over 40 years was emotionally taxing, yet profoundly liberating. Each box packed was a step towards my new future. Movers, efficient and impersonal, entered the rooms, their footsteps echoing in the suddenly vast spaces. The memories lingered, of course, Arthur's laughter in the kitchen, Michael's childhood drawings, the scent of roses from the garden. There were moments of intense sadness, a grieving for the life that was, for the family I thought I had. But interwoven with that sadness was a growing sense of peace, of self-reclamation. I was no longer defined by that house, by their expectations. I found a lovely, modern two-bedroom apartment in a quiet complex on the other side of town, closer to my old friend Eleanor, whom I had reconnected with since my decision. It had a small balcony perfect for a few pots of herbs and flowers, a bright, airy living room, and, most importantly, no historical baggage, no ingrained expectations. It was a blank canvas, waiting for me to paint my new life upon it. As I unpacked the few precious mementos I had chosen to bring, photographs of Arthur, a small painting we'd bought on our honeymoon, his favorite armchair, I felt a sense of lightness I hadn't experienced in years. The healing had begun, not through their apologies or understanding, but through my own actions, my own assertion of self-worth. I was building new, true connections, starting with the one I had with myself. The house, my old life, was sold. My new life was just beginning. The transition to my new apartment was smoother than I could have hoped. The smaller space, initially a concern, proved to be a blessing. It was manageable, cozy, and entirely mine. There were no echoes of past demands, no rooms filled with the unspoken weight of familial expectation. I decorated it slowly, thoughtfully, choosing colors and furnishings that pleased me, without a single thought to what Sarah might deem modern, or Chloe might find Instagrammable. My little balcony soon boasted cheerful geraniums and fragrant rosemary, a small nod to Arthur's magnificent garden, but on a scale that suited my new, simpler life. Peace settled around me like a warm shawl. The frantic energy of the house sale, the emotional upheaval of the confrontation, began to fade into the background, replaced by a quiet contentment. I reconnected with Eleanor, and we fell back into the easy rhythm of our old friendship, sharing coffees, visiting art galleries, and taking gentle walks in the nearby park. I joined a book club, started a watercolor class, things I'd vaguely thought about for years, but never had the time or, perhaps, the self-permission to pursue while I was so enmeshed in my family's needs. I heard very little from Michael, Sarah, or Chloe. The wedding, I learned through the grapevine, did take place at the hotel ballroom. It was, by all accounts, a perfectly adequate affair, though lacking the personal charm and emotional resonance they had envisioned for my garden. I was not invited, nor did I expect to be. A part of me felt a twinge of sadness at this final severance, at the thought of my granddaughter's wedding occurring without my presence. But a larger part of me felt relief. I had drawn my line, and they had, in their own way, respected it by leaving me to my new life. With the substantial proceeds from the sale of the house, I was financially secure, a fact that brought its own quiet satisfaction. After setting aside enough for my own comfortable future, I decided to honor Arthur's memory in a way I knew he would have loved. He had always had a soft spot for the local animal shelter, often grumbling about people who didn't take proper care of their pets. I made a significant anonymous donation to them, enough to fund a much-needed expansion of their cat wing. I imagined his gruff, but pleased reaction, and it made me smile. It felt good to use that money, born from such a painful situation, to create something positive, something that reflected true generosity, not obligation. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I would reflect on the whole saga. The sting of Chloe's cheap comment had long since faded, but the lessons learned remained sharp and clear. I understood now that love, true love, does not demand endless sacrifice without respect. It does not erase one's identity or belittle one's worth. I had allowed myself to become invisible, to be taken for granted, and in a harsh, painful way, their actions had forced me to see that and to reclaim myself. I had discovered a strength I hadn't known I possessed, the strength to say no, the strength to choose my own path, even if it meant disrupting the comfortable illusions of others. My new life was not dramatic or grand, but it was authentically mine. I found joy in small things, the morning sun on my balcony, a good book, a shared laugh with Eleanor, the quiet satisfaction of a watercolor painting finally looking the way I intended. I was no longer just grandma, or mom in the limiting way they had defined me, a caregiver, a provider, a convenient backdrop. I was Amelia, a woman with her own thoughts, her own desires, her own life. And I was, at last, profoundly at peace. The sale of the house had been more than a financial transaction, it had been an act of liberation, a quiet execution of justice not born of vengeance, but of a deep, abiding need for self-respect. I had found my sanctuary, just as Arthur had hoped I would. And so, the house was sold, and a new chapter began. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe. Feel free to share your story in the comments, I'd genuinely love to read them. Remember, your voice matters, and sometimes the quietest actions make the loudest statements. You are stronger than you think.